Vincent stepped in front of me at the door of the funeral home and told me I was not allowed to speak. He said it quietly, the way people say things they have rehearsed, and for a moment I thought I misheard him. I asked him to repeat it. He looked past me toward the guests filing in behind us and said our father had made it clear before he died that he did not want me turning the service into something about myself. I stood there in my black dress with a folded index card in my coat pocket, 3 sentences I had written the night before about the man who raised me, and I felt the words go cold in my hand. I am Denise Monroe, I am 44 years old, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. My father, Harold Monroe, died 9 days earlier after a long decline that I had watched happen one visit at a time, one medication schedule at a time, one 3 in the morning phone call at a time. I had been the one driving 40 minutes to his house 4, and sometimes 5 days a week for the better part of a year. I had been the one who learned to work the oxygen machine, who memorized which foods he could still swallow safely, who sat with him through the nights his mind wandered, and he called out for my mother, who had been gone 11 years. None of that seemed to matter standing in that doorway. Vincent's wife Joanna touched his arm and gave me a look that was somewhere between pity and warning, the kind of look you give someone you have already decided is the problem. My younger sister Camille would not meet my eyes at all. I took my seat in the last row, the folded card still in my pocket, and I listened to people I barely recognized describe a version of my father's final year that did not include me. An older woman, too, rose up, leaned toward her husband, and whispered that it was such a shame I had pulled away from our father at the end, that grief made people do strange things. I did not correct her. I did not have the strength to correct anyone. I only wondered where that story had come from, because it was not what happened, and yet everyone around me seemed to already believe it as settled fact, spoken with the easy certainty of something repeated many times before it ever reached me. A cousin I had not spoken to in years offered me a stiff, careful hug near the guest book and said she was glad I had finally come around at the end, as though my presence there that day was some kind of late correction rather than the continuation of a year I had never once stepped away from. I wanted to ask her what she meant by finally, but the words caught somewhere behind my teeth, and I only nodded and let her walk away believing whatever she believed. Dorothy Wells, our father's neighbor of 20 years, caught my eye from across the aisle with an expression I could not quite place, somewhere between confusion and something she was holding back. She had lived 3 houses down from my father since before I could remember, and she had watched my car pull into that driveway more evenings than either of us could count, so her hesitation told me she had heard the same story everyone else had, and it did not match what her own eyes had shown her for a year straight. During the reception before the service, Samuel Price, an old friend of my father's from the hardware store where he had worked for 3 decades, pulled me aside and asked quietly whether I had truly stopped visiting the way people were saying. I told him no, that I had been there constantly, and his face changed in a way that told me he had already suspected as much. It was the first small crack in the story that surrounded me, and it opened a question I could not stop turning over. If I had been the one there every day, then someone else had spent months building a different account of that year, one where I was absent and someone else was devoted, and that account had apparently reached every relative in that room before I ever arrived. I watched Vincent accept condolences near the casket, shaking hands, nodding gravely, playing the part of the son who had carried the family through its hardest year. And something in the ease of his performance told me this was not new information he was reacting to. This was a story he had already told more than once, refined the way a story gets refined only through repetition, until every detail fits and every listener nods along without a question. I remembered a phone call from Vincent nearly 8 months earlier, one afternoon when I had mentioned driving out to check on our father's new prescription. He had told me, almost casually, that I did not need to keep coming so often, that he and Joanna had it handled, that our father needed less commotion and more rest. I had brushed it off then as one brother being protective. Standing in that funeral home, it no longer felt casual at all. It felt like the opening move of something I had not recognized as a move until that exact moment. Anita Foster, the home care nurse who had worked with my father 3 afternoons a week during his final months, arrived late and slipped into a seat near the back. She caught my eye and gave a small, uncertain nod, the kind you give someone when you are not sure what version of events you are supposed to agree with in a room like that. I wanted to ask her what she had heard, what Vincent had told her, whether she too believed I had disappeared, but the service was starting and Graham Pierce, the funeral director, was stepping to the podium with a folder in his hands. He thanked everyone for coming, spoke briefly about my father's 40 years in that house on Larkspur Road, and then said something that made the room go still in a different way. He said Harold had come to him personally 3 weeks before his death with a specific request, something he had recorded himself and asked to be played exactly as he left it, with no editing and no interruption. Graham said my father had been particular about the timing, that it needed to happen after the eulogies, before the closing prayer, so his words would be the last thing anyone remembered from that room. I felt Camille shift beside me. I saw Vincent's jaw tighten from 3 rows up. Joanna reached over and gripped his hand the way you grip someone before something happens that you already know you cannot control. Graham nodded to the technician near the small screen set up beside the casket, and the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when nobody yet understands what they are about to hear. But everybody senses that whatever it is will not be simple. The screen flickered once, and my father's face appeared, thinner than I remembered from even a month before, sitting in his recliner with the afternoon light coming through the window behind him. He looked into the camera the way he used to look at me across the kitchen table when he had something serious to say, and the first word out of his mouth was my name spoken in his own recorded voice. Sounded like a door opening in a room I did not know I was still standing outside of. Harold looked directly into the camera and said that if I was watching this, it meant he had run out of time to say it himself, and he wanted it said plainly, in front of everyone, because he knew what would happen once he was gone if it was left unsaid. He said I had been the one who cared for him. Not occasionally. Not when it was convenient. Every week, for the better part of a year, while his body failed him one function at a time. He said he wanted that stated as fact, not as sentiment, because he had learned that facts were the only thing that could survive a family determined to rewrite its own history. Then he said that Vincent had asked me to stop visiting so often, months earlier, not out of concern for his rest, but because Vincent wanted to be the one managing him, the one making decisions, the one who would be remembered as the devoted son when the time came. He said Vincent had been telling relatives, coworkers, even the pastor, that I had pulled away, that I could not handle watching him decline, that I had left the real caregiving to Vincent and Joanna. The room around me had gone completely still. I heard someone too rose back and hail sharply. Vincent did not move. He said he had known for months what Vincent was doing, because Vincent, in his own quiet arrogance, had made a mistake. He had asked Harold to sign a written statement, something Vincent's own attorney friend had drafted, describing me as emotionally unstable and unfit to be involved in decisions about his care or his affairs. Harold said he had read it twice, sitting at his kitchen table, and had refused to sign it. He said he understood exactly what that statement was meant to do long after he was gone, and he was not willing to let his name be used to erase what I had done for him. Then his expression changed, and he said, "But there is something Denise does not know." I felt my whole body go rigid in that pew. Harold said he had watched me quietly give up shifts at my own job to be there for his appointments, had watched me stretch what little I had left each month to cover gaps in his care that insurance would not touch. And he had never once heard me complain about any of it, not to him, not to anyone. He said he understood that I would never have told this to the family myself, because that was not who I was, and that was precisely why he needed to say it instead, on camera, where no one afterward could claim it had been exaggerated or misremembered. He said he feared exactly this moment, a funeral where the truth would be quietly buried under a more convenient story, and he had decided he would not allow that to happen to me the way it had nearly happened to his own mother decades earlier. A story he said he had never told any of us until now. The video ended there, the screen going dark, and for a long moment nobody in that room said a word. Vincent finally stood, his voice unsteady, and said that their father had been confused near the end, that the illness had affected his thinking, that nobody should take a sick man's recorded ramblings as the full picture. Samuel Price stood before anyone could respond to that. He said Harold had told him the same thing himself, sitting on his porch 2 months earlier, clear-eyed and entirely lucid, and that Harold had specifically asked him to remember it in case anyone ever tried to claim otherwise. Anita Foster stood next, her voice quiet but certain, and said she had documented every one of my visits in her own care log because Harold had asked her to, precisely so there would be a record independent of anything the family might later say. Dorothy Wells added, from her seat, that she had watched my car in that driveway more evenings than she could count, and had in fact mentioned as much to Vincent directly, months earlier, when he first told her a different story. The room shifted, quietly and completely, the way a room shifts when three separate people who have no reason to coordinate all confirm the same inconvenient truth at once. Vincent tried once more to speak, something about how none of them understood the full context, but Joanna, still holding his hand, would not look at him, and Camille finally turned toward me for the first time all day, her eyes wet, and mouthed that she was sorry. Graham Pierce, visibly moved but steady, asked if I still wished to speak, since it seemed there had been a misunderstanding about the program. I stood, the folded card still in my coat pocket, though I no longer needed it. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Vincent while I spoke. I talked about the way my father hummed old country songs off-key while he made coffee, about the particular way he folded his newspaper each morning even after his hands began to shake, about the joke he made every single time I walked through his door, asking if I had come to check that he was still breathing, and laughing at it every time as though it were new. I talked about the last conversation we had, 3 nights before he died, when he told me he was not afraid, only tired, and asked me to make sure Sadie knew how proud he was of her. These were not details anyone recites about a man they abandoned. They were details that only accumulate through presence, through years of ordinary Tuesdays nobody else had bothered to witness. When I sat down, nobody offered applause, and nobody needed to. In the weeks after the funeral, I did not scream at Vincent, and I did not demand an apology I suspected he was incapable of giving honestly. I simply stopped including him in decisions about our father's estate and let his own attorney friend discover, through the proper channels, that Harold's written wishes matched exactly what he had said on that recording. I began speaking to Camille again, slowly, because she had at least been honest once the truth was standing in front of her. I did not speak to Vincent for many months, and when I finally did, it was brief, businesslike, and without warmth, because some things cannot be rebuilt simply because they have been exposed. What I learned is that a person's role in a family cannot be quietly rewritten just because they were the quiet one, and that silence is not the same thing as absence. The people who show up without asking for credit are often the easiest ones to erase, right up until someone insists on remembering out loud. If you have ever been the one who did the hardest, least visible work in your family and watched someone else take the credit for it, I hope you find your own version of that recording, whatever form it takes. And I hope it arrives before the story about you gets to harden into something false. Their lies unraveled the moment 3 honest people, and 1 honest dead man, refused to let a comfortable version of the truth stand.